Hi, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Katie Burchett, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Olivia Caldwell Foundation. We have been hosting these educational mental health webinars now for a little over a year, with the goal of being able to share on different topics with experts from around our local community and across the country who can help us with better understanding pediatric mental health and how to support our children. I'm really excited for today's topic. We have with us Eileen Devine, who is a licensed clinical social worker from Portland, Oregon, with over 20 years of clinical experience. For the last 10 years, she has focused solely on supporting parents from all over the world with children with neurobehavioral conditions. So, thank you so much, Eileen, for joining us today and for your willingness to share on this topic with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to be here as well. So that 10-year mark that she mentioned is really kind of critical, I think, at least in my own personal parenting journey. My daughter came into our life, she's 14, so 14 years ago. And about when she was 3 or 4, things were definitely not typical with her development and with some of the behaviors that we were seeing. We have what society would consider a neurotypical son who's only 15 months older than her. So we almost had this side-by-side comparison, and we knew that something was different and that those differences were becoming more of a challenging for her, a challenge for us as a family. So it really led me on this path to try to figure it out. Like, what could I do as a parent to really help her experience less challenging behaviors? That's the language I have to describe it now. It might not have been 10 years ago. But once I got on this path that resonated with me, that worked for our family, changed the trajectory of our family, of her life, certainly reduced her frustration, reduced our frustration as parents, I thought, man, why isn't anyone teaching parents this? And so that's when I began this work. So I'm very passionate about it and really excited to be here with all of you. We're going to talk a lot about the brain today. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of neuroscience research that tells us without a doubt that behaviors and brain are connected. So if we are considering a behavior like, why is my child always challenging in this way? Why are they always misbehaving? Why are they ruining everything? Why are they always so irritable or aggressive or whatever it might be? We have to consider what's happening with their unique brain as well. I think about it as behaviors living inside the brain. We simply cannot consider one without the other. So that's why we're going to be talking a lot about brains today. And if a brain works differently, whether we know the reason or not, what does that mean for the behaviors that we see? So what does this have to do with behaviors anyway? It has to do everything with behavior. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of neuroscience research to support this, that when we have behaviors, challenging or otherwise, that the brain is involved. And once we can understand that the brain is the source of all behaviors, and that behaviors are actually a symptom of a brain working differently and not having the environment that recognizes that and understands that fully, that's when it starts to make sense. Like, oh, this is why I'm seeing this challenging behavior. This is why my child is acting this way in this situation every single day. That's why these traditional parenting techniques do not work for my child and actually make things worse. It reduces our frustration as parents. I know I've had providers who have shared with me that it's reduced their frustration. They feel more effective in working and supporting these kids and families. It reduces our child's frustration, right? They feel more understood and they can settle in their body and in their environments, and it improves outcomes. When we start to understand this connection, which I'm going to walk you through today, we start to see our child be able to settle. They have less symptoms, less challenging behaviors. So the brain is the brain is the brain. I say this to the parents that I work with all the time. And what I mean by that is that if the brain has been changed in some way, its structure, its function, no matter the source, challenging behaviors, behavioral symptoms are often our first clue that that's happening, right? So there's all these different reasons that a brain can be impacted, can be changed. It can be illness, it can be traumatic entry into the world at birth, it can be trauma experienced prenatally or postnatally. It can be prenatal substance exposure, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or other substances, medical events at the time of the birth, neuroimmune conditions. A lot of the families that I work with, their children have Lyme or PANS or PANDAS. It can be caused by very unique and rare gene mutations. It can be the result of a traumatic brain injury, a seizure disorder. So we have names for all of those, right? We have ADHD, autism, PTSD, PANS and PANDAS, FASD. What I want you to understand is that the brain is the brain is the brain. There are absolutely some unique aspects to each of those diagnoses that I just rattled off, and it's important for us to understand those. But when we're talking about how to support this child in front of us, the most important thing is to understand that their brain works differently than what we in society expects for a child of their age, and that the behaviors that we see are a reflection of that. Those are the symptoms of that brain working differently. So when I start to walk parents through this, we talk about this brain first approach. We're looking at most of us come into parenting looking at our child through a behavioral lens. So this behavior is being done on purpose, willfully to me all the time to make my life difficult, right? It's relentless, and we see it as the child being very intentional, manipulative, right, about what they're doing. When we shift to a brain first lens, we're seeing this through the lens of the brain and behavior connection. And that if their brain works differently, there's going to be some things that are really, really difficult for them to do. And if that goes unrecognized and we're constantly expecting them to do the thing, seemingly easy tasks that they cannot do, we will see symptoms. Of course, they will be irritable. They will be more anxious. They will withdraw and shut down and be depressed, right? So if we all understand, and again, we have research to support this, that a brain-based disability is a physical condition. The brain is a part of our body. It's been changed in some way, function or structure. Then what does that mean for the way that you as parents or providers understand and support those neurodiverse children in your life, those children that can be incredibly challenging from that behavioral standpoint? What does it mean for the way you understand their challenging behaviors? It really lines up very nicely with what we do for all kids, all individuals, really, it's not just kids, who have a physical disability. We provide them with accommodations, right? That's what's just and fair and right. And it's what works, it's what helps them navigate their world successfully. The same is true for our kids that have brain-based differences. So these accommodations, it's appropriate, it's effective, just like it would be with any other individual who has a different type of physical disability. I tell parents all the time that accommodations are the treatment for challenging behavioral symptoms. So when parents come to me, things usually aren't going very well, right? Their child can have these very relentless, exhausting, frustrating, sometimes scary behaviors. And so when I help them understand that behavior modification techniques that have only escalated things in the home, that's not the path towards less challenging behaviors. I know that's your goal. I understand that goal. It's a really good goal to have. We would all want that. And also, this is the way to get there. This understanding the brain behavior connection, understanding then what is your child being asked to do in their day-to-day life that they simply don't have the skills to do because their brain works differently. And how can you then develop meaningful accommodations that helps them settle to support those lagging skills? So again, the brain is the brain is the brain. There's all these different reasons why the brain is changed in function and structure. The thing that all of these diagnoses or events have in common is that they are often associated with changes in behaviors, right? There's similar, challenging, confusing, and misunderstood behavioral symptoms. So I want to break this concept of this brain behavior connection and parenting from a brain first lens. I want to break it down even more. So we're going to go over this fairly quickly in the interest of time. And please note any questions that you might have, right? Think about how this might apply to your child, what questions you might have. Where are you experiencing some like, I'm not sure if I get that or I believe that. I don't know if I buy into it, because that's where we grow. That's where we start to really understand what this means for us and challenge those deeply held beliefs and values that we have about behavior so that we can lean more into this idea of parenting from this brain first lens and move farther away from the behavioral lens. So I'm going to break this concept down for you a little bit more. All of these behaviors that your child is demonstrating every day, ones that are challenging, ones that are not, even for us, right? We want to look at them through primary characteristics and secondary characteristics. And this is really just to make the idea more manageable for us to be able to really integrate it into our learning and the way we look at our child. So primary characteristics are those behaviors that help us gain insight into how a child's brain works differently than we or society would expect that it does. So it includes such things as executive functioning, processing pace, communication, language skills, learning and memory, and so much more. So we start to make these assumptions about our child based on societal norms. And we assume that everyone fits into what is actually a very narrow definition of neurotypical, and that they can do certain things at certain ages. When we take a step back and understand, well, that's a cognitive skill that depends on our brain working typically, right? And if the brain has been impacted in some way, what if? What if your child, even at an older age, simply can't do that thing? So one of the assumptions that we make is that at a certain age, individuals can think fast and listen fast. So I've made that assumption about all of you. This is where I'm always reminded that I've done that. I've made that assumption about all of you, that you can listen to what I'm saying. Hopefully I'm not talking too quickly. You can think about it really at the same time. Does this fit with my child? Does it not? Does it resonate? Does it not? Do I believe what she's saying, or I have my misgivings? You're thinking about it as I'm talking. We know that individuals who have brains that work differently process slowly. So the way I describe my 14-year-old is that she is a 10-second child in a 1-second world. If you rush through things, she starts to get amped up. That anxiety and that overwhelm builds very quickly. So the accommodation for her is to slow down, give her more time to process what I'm asking, right? So another one is predicting and planning ahead, connecting the dots. A plus B equals this really terrible C. So, I better not do A plus B. That would be a really bad idea. Obvious to us, not obvious to many kids. And I say kids, but I mean teens and also young adults who have brains that work differently. They have a very difficult time with that seemingly simple equation of A plus B equals C. So we say, what were you thinking? How could you possibly think that was a good idea? They weren't. They weren't able to predict and plan ahead in the way that most of us can. Multitasking and prioritizing. What if you have a 12-year-old who can only hold one direction in their mind at a time? So you give them one direction and they go do it. You give them 2, 3, certainly 4, and they get distracted, they get lost, they forget, right? And then you see them not doing steps 2, 3, and 4, and you say, what are you doing? I told you to get ready. We talked about this, right? What if? It's not about them just not wanting to, or defiance, or not caring. What if they can only do one thing at a time? Learning and remembering and applying information. This is life, right? This is school, certainly. What if you have a child who needs to be retaught thousands of more times, even something that's done every single day? So most kids at the beginning of the school year, the teacher will spend like 2 weeks going over the routine, the morning routine, let's say, of the classroom. And then most kids have it and they're good for the rest of the school year. What if your child needs to have the reteaching of what that morning routine looks like, 300 more times. They finally get it the last month of school. Not uncommon, right? If we didn't see it though, like, oh, they need this accommodation, they need us to reteach 1,000 more times than we thought they needed. And instead we see it as they're always messing around. They just don't want to do what the teacher asked. Two very different lenses, sends us on completely different paths in terms of our relationship with that child and what we do with them to support them. Inhibiting impulses, we know that kids around the age of 5 generally are able to inhibit their impulses. So they get frustrated with a peer. They don't just, whack them. They don't just push them over. They don't just run through whoever's in their way to get to what they want. They're able to wait, right? I can't help you now. You need to wait. We can't do that now, but we can do it later. You're going to have to wait, right? They can inhibit those impulses. What if you have a child, again, who's a 6th grader, a 7th grader, who still has the impulsivity of a toddler? What does that mean for the way that you understand their impulsive behavior? And how do you put accommodations and support around them to help reduce risk of them getting in trouble, right? Getting into those situations with their peers, for example. Ignoring and managing sensory input. This is oftentimes where I see parents start to understand, like, maybe my child experiences the world differently than their friends or their siblings, because they see the sensory overwhelm that happens with their child. What if you have a child who's easily overstimulated and they want to go do the thing, but it ends terribly, and you're like, you wanted to come to the birthday party, you were excited about it for weeks, and you get there and you melt down and you start throwing things, like, what is that about? You wanted to do this. Why did you ruin it, right? What if they were excited about it? They wanted to be at the birthday party with their friends. They could not manage the environment. What does that mean for the accommodations we put in place so that they can still do the thing and be involved and be included, but be successful while they're doing it? Identifying and solving problems. So very complex cognitive skill. And at older ages, as kids get older, we expect them to be able to solve more complex problems on their own. The first thing they have to do is recognize that there's a problem to be solved, right? Really difficult for some of these kids, even at older ages. Once they do that, I mean, what do we do when we identify a problem, like as working adults, as parents? We almost instantaneously come up with several solutions to solve that problem, right? We're doing this all day long, problem solving in this way. We play out both of those options. We put them in juxtaposition to each other. Which one's going to work best? Which one is best for this situation? And then we move forward, right? That's really complex. We do it in our head. It's very abstract, really, really difficult for many of these kids, teens, young adults who don't have the skills yet to be able to problem solve in this way. So these are just a few examples to start to get you familiar with this idea of this is how to see a child, a situation, a behavior through a brain first lens versus this behavioral lens. So when I'm working with parents, we spend time going through in a lot of detail all of these cognitive skills, all these primary characteristics, what our brain does for us every day. And this is the list, again, just breaking it down into more categories to make it more manageable. We're not going to have time, obviously, to go through all of them today, but there's 2 that I wanted to focus in on because in my experience, they're foundational to understanding our kids who have brains that work differently with challenging behavioral symptoms. And it will also give you hopefully even a greater sense of this parenting paradigm that I'm talking you through. So when we look at these, some kids will struggle in some areas and not in other areas, right? They're not going to necessarily have lagging cognitive skills in all areas. There are some kids who do, right? But that's why it's important to go through this with your unique child in mind. So a child with, for example, ADHD that's 10 years old, next to a child with ADHD who's 10 years old, there's going to be a lot of overlap, but there will be some unique qualities in terms of which of these primary characteristics they have difficulty with, that they get in their way day after day after day. So the first one again, there's two that I'm going to dive into a little deeper. The first one is dysmaturity. And again, the reason why I want to talk about dysmaturity is because I have never worked with parents whose child did not experience some amount of dysmaturity. And it's one of those primary characteristics that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it completely shifts the way you see your child, right? From this behavioral lens to this brain first lens. So dysmaturity is the gap between an individual's chronological age and their developmental age, where they are versus where we expect them to be with social, emotional skills and in relation to other cognitive skills. So they're not acting immaturely. They're not acting like a baby. They don't need to just grow up, right? They are the age they are, and that is a brain thing. So when we understand, okay, what age does this remind me of? For example, you have your child. Well, I'll give an example today. My daughter's at horse camp this week, and she is experiencing some tension between another camper, another peer there. She's 14. This camper is about 11. And on the way to camp this morning, I was walking her through some of the social emotional pieces. How might she mediate? How might this conflict? How might she get support in mediating this conflict? It is not the conversation you would need to have with a neurotypical 14-year-old. So taking her age, dividing it in half, 7, is a pretty good starting point in terms of what age she reminds me of much of the time, socially and emotionally, but in relation to other cognitive skills. And it doesn't mean that I say, well, she has dysmaturity, nothing I can do about it. It's actually the complete opposite. It's, oh, she's 14, going on 7 in this situation, like the situation with this peer at camp. And I need to help support her and help her develop and gain understanding, build her skills as I would a 7-year-old. I need to meet her where she's at, right? So a lot of times taking the chronological age, dividing it into half is a good starting point for some of these kids. It's gonna be different with different cognitive skills, but that is not uncommon to begin there. And asking yourself, when you are in the midst of a challenging situation or frustrating or embarrassing situation with your child and the way that they're behaving, what age does this remind me of? And what would I do to support a child of that age in this situation, right? How would I help them understand how their actions impact others, how to connect the dots, how to be in relationship with another person, right? It helps settle us and it helps settle them as well. The other primary characteristic that I wanted to dive into is executive functioning. And again, the reason for this is I've not worked with a family where at least some pieces of executive functioning, lagging skills in relation to executive functioning, come up for their kids. And again, helping the parent understand they would do better if they could. You think because they're 14, they should be here with this skill. They're just not. What if they need a lot more support in this situation to be able to be successful? Accommodations, right? So that's always the goal and the pattern here. Many of us understand a little bit about executive functioning, but there's, in my experience, some few key pieces that get missed that are pretty big ones. So I wanted to go through it in a little more detail. Difficulty transitioning or shifting gears. I think that's a more commonly known one by parents. Difficulty transitioning from recess back into the quiet classroom or from school back to home, those big transitions from summertime back into the school year, which many of us are experiencing now. But shifting gears can also look like cognitively shifting gears. So an example would be you have plans to go do something really fun with your child the next day, and you've been looking forward to it, and they're looking forward to it. And you wake up, you go out to the car, and the car won't start. And it's a Sunday, there's no places that are open. You just can't get to the place that you were planning to go to. Everybody, including yourself, are really disappointed. It's like, oh, we're so looking forward to this, and there's just no possible way that it can happen today. Maybe if you have neurotypical children, those children are able to rise and fall with the excitement and then disappointment. We're going to go, And now we're not. There's nothing we can do about it. That's so frustrating. I'm so sad, right? Your child who experiences neurobehavioral conditions, they might be spiraling out of control, whatever that looks like behaviorally, for the next 2 hours, right? Because they cannot manage the shifting of gears. Like, I'm excited, I'm anticipating, I'm looking forward to. Now it's not happening, and I'm disappointed. Their brain does not work that smoothly, or that it does not have that kind of organization that allows them to shift gears. So instead of reaching for our power and control and getting even more frustrated with them in that moment, how do we lead with empathy and understand, like, they would do better if they could. They literally don't have the skills to be able to manage this disappointment. How am I going to then approach them with empathy leading the way versus this behavioral management approach? Upset by unexpected changes in tasks or routines. So a substitute teacher, for example, I had a family that I was working with, and they had rearranged the furniture in their room because they were having some construction done in their living room. The daughter knew they were having construction done. She did not know that they were going to have to rearrange the entire configuration of the living room. So they did that one day, not even thinking about it, when she was at school, and she came home and just completely lost it. She was beside herself because she did not expect to come into her home and have it look differently. She couldn't make sense of it. She couldn't manage it. We talked about impulsive behaviors, difficulty getting started and engaged. I think that's a pretty common one that folks are aware of, but I wanted to highlight that, especially non-preferred activities. Okay. So motivation, for example, I encourage the parents I work with to think of motivation as a cognitive skill. It's not a character trait, an inherent character trait, right? Motivation comes very easily to my neurotypical son. He does not have to work very hard to be motivated. I hear him say, "Oh, I don't want to do this," and then he goes and does it, right? My daughter, she has a very difficult time getting over the inertia, getting over like the cognitive load of like, oh, I have to go to do this thing that's unpleasant, that's hard, that I don't enjoy, right? So thinking of that, especially non-preferred activities, there's a reason why your child starting screen time is super easy for them. But getting ready for the morning and going into school, which is probably very cognitively heavy in terms of its load, is difficult for them, right? Difficulty staying engaged or finishing a task, and then again, unable to link past experiences to current situation. This is when we talk about traditional parenting approaches. One of them is consequences. If you do that again, this is what will happen to you. Are we clear? They say, yes, we're clear. Okay, then you're clear. Don't do it again. And then sometimes the next hour, but the next day, the next week, they do the thing. And you say, I told you what would happen. Why did you do it? Here's your consequence. But that consequence over and over and over again does nothing to change their behavior. It's not working in the way you hoped it would or intended it to. Why is that? If your child does not have the executive functioning skills to link that past experience from a week ago, bring it into their mind in the present moment, have the impulse control to say, oh, mom warned me about this. Mom said, if I do this, this is what's going to happen to me. They don't have those skills. The consequence is not going to work for them, right? So sometimes I remember when I heard that, when my mentor said to me, you just got to get rid of consequences, it's not going to work for her. I was like, what? What do you do then? How do you parent, right? That's going from a behavioral lens to this more relational brain first lens. All right, executive functioning still. Identifying goals, planning steps to reach them. I think that's a common one we all are familiar with. But getting stuck in behavioral or verbal loops or perseveration. So having a child who keeps needling their brother or sister over and over and over and over again, and you're like, stop, stop, stop. You're escalating kind of in your threats and in your frustration, your behaviors. And meanwhile, their behavior is escalating, right? Why can't they stop? Why can't they stop? Because kids who have brains that work differently can get stuck. They can get stuck in behavioral loops or verbal loops. For example, asking the same question over and over and over and over again, our tendency is usually to answer them verbally, right? That's what we usually do with those people in our life where we're having that conversation. What if they can't hold on to the verbal information long enough to have it satisfy their need to get that question answered, right? But we still persist in doing that again, usually rising in our frustration, understandably. They're getting more frustrated because they just want their question answered, even though we've done it a million times. So not uncommon at all. How do you help them get unstuck? Distraction, play, right? Moving their body. Those are accommodations. So instead of saying stop, 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 using our power and control, taking a step back, taking a deep breath and saying, oh, they're stuck again. How am I going to help them get unstuck? That's the path towards accommodations. That's the path towards them settling. That's the path towards this behavior becoming less intense. Cognitively rigid. They can't let go in an argument. They literally cannot let go. They're following you around the house, trying to still engage you in the argument. They can't handle the word no. So, I work with parents on, I know you need to say no sometimes. That's part of parenting. It's not unrealistic to say yes to everything. How can we say no without using the word no, right? Difficulty seeing other people's point of views. This is also an abstract thinking skill, but not being able to understand the link between their behavior and others' emotions, how their behavior impacts others, not being able to put themselves in someone else's shoes. That was a lot of what I was doing with my daughter on the drive to camp today was, well, how do you think it made her feel when you responded that way? And you can see her really stop and think about it. And it's hard for her to go there without my support, right? So instead of me saying, well, that wasn't nice, don't do that again, no wonder this happened, I'm taking a step back and thinking about how are her lagging skills getting in the way. She cannot put herself in someone else's shoes without me helping her get there. It's too abstract for her, right? Empathy. This is like the basis of empathy. I've had parents say to me, I don't think my child is capable of empathy, which is a really awful, scary thought to have as a parent. But when we break it down into cognitive skills and they understand, like, oh, my child just doesn't have the skills yet to take this empathetic stance, how can I build those skills and help them get there versus shaming them, punishing them, isolating them every time they have a response that's not empathetic, right? So if you think of a child who's very young, say like 3 years old, maybe 4 years old, they're not very empathetic usually, not consistently. And that's not because all kids that age are bad. It's because kids of that age don't have the skills yet. So that's why we do a lot of redos, we do a lot of reteaching, role modeling, a lot of mediation in terms of their friendships, right? What if you have a child who's 10, 11, 12 and is still lagging behind in those skills, just like a 2 or a 3 or a 4-year-old is, and you still have to build them and help them get there? It reduces our anxiety, helps us feel more effective, like, okay, there is something I can do to help them and support them, and we have a clear path on how to do that. Can't see what's coming next. I talked about that A plus B equals this terrible C, can't anticipate outcomes, right? And then difficulty tolerating frustration or staying emotionally regulated. I'm going to talk more about that one here because it's such a big one. So you have this minor frustration and your child explodes, totally disproportionate to what you view that minor frustration as, the impact of that minor frustration. And maybe you're recovering all day long, trying to get them to recover from that minor frustration. And I have parents who say, like, if they don't get their way, they're so rigid. If people don't see it from their perspective, that's what happens, right? If their shoes don't get tied exactly in the way they wanted it to, right? If they wake up and the thing I've made them for breakfast that they've had straight for the last 2 weeks is not what they had in their mind for wanting to eat for breakfast, right? And they're recovering the rest of the morning. That is not about your child being an ungrateful, awful, terrible, bad child, right? It's about them not having the emotional regulation skills that we would expect them to at that age. This is executive functioning again. So I think of it as this window of tolerance. My 15-year-old, for example, who I said is what society would consider neurotypical, he gets frustrated with us. He doesn't always see things the way we see things. We have to set gentle boundaries, and sometimes he doesn't agree with them. But he'll say, "That's unfair. I don't agree. I'm so annoyed with you." Maybe he'll go into his room and shut his door, right? And calm down on his own until he's ready to enter back into relationship and conversation with us. He does not punch holes in the walls. He does not break things in his room, right? He has a window of tolerance that can rise and fall. It's quite wide. It's what we would expect for a neurotypical teenager. And rarely, if ever, does he get thrown out of his window of tolerance where his behavior is just escalated to a point where we're like, whoa, that just never happens with him. My daughter, who again is 15 months younger, her window of tolerance is like this. So things like her shoes not being tied the way she likes it, or clothes not feeling right, or minor frustrations, interactions with her brother, with her cousin, with her friends, right? It doesn't take much for her to be thrown out of her window of tolerance. That's not her fault. It's because her brain works very, very differently. So the way we grow skills, help our kids grow skills, is to challenge their window of tolerance. We want them to grow, but to also be very mindful of how narrow it is. And we start to see behavioral symptoms that show us they're getting out of their window of tolerance. Then we soothe, we lead with empathy, we provide accommodations to help them come back into it, right? Because when they're out of their window of tolerance, they flip their lid, their thinking brain is now offline. And usually how we respond is, sit down. That was inappropriate. We don't talk that way in our house. We're going to talk about this. Go to your room. Think about what you did. All of these cognitive skills required of them to do those things that we've just rattled off while their thinking brain is offline. So difficult for them to do maybe on a good day, impossible for them to do when their thinking brain is offline. And so the accommodation for that, again, is to be observant, get crystal clear on what does it look like behaviorally when your child is about to be thrown out of their window of tolerance. Provide them with support, soothing, empathy, whatever it might be, so they can remain in that. Usually it involves less words, us talking less, right? Maybe being physically present. Some kids like to have their space, but a lot of kids need our physical presence, but without words, so that we can let things settle, let their nervous system settle, let our nervous system settle, so that we can enter back into the conversation at a later time when their thinking brain is online. They can hear us, they can process what we're saying, they can see our perspective, right? So it's not to not do anything, it's to delay, usually your first inclination, right? To solve it now in this moment. The opportunity for that is not going to be lost. And in fact, your energy will be better spent if you wait. All right, so those are primary characteristics very quickly and in a nutshell, but hopefully it gives you a sense of lagging skills. When those aren't recognized and your child is hitting up against them all day long, what happens? We see behavioral symptoms, right? So that's the second group of behaviors. If you're not familiar with Dr. Ross Green, most people are, I feel like, in this world, but in this world of parenting children with challenging behavioral symptoms. He wrote the book Explosive Child and several other books that are really good, but Explosive Child is the one I recommend the most. He has this quote, "Children exhibit challenging behaviors when the demands being placed upon them outstrip the skills they have to respond adaptively to those demands. The same can be said of all human beings." Okay, so I use it's a silly example, but it helps solidify this for folks, that as a clinical social worker, if I was told tomorrow, you have no choice but to become an electrical engineer, and you should be grateful that you have a job and you have a master's degree, so you're going to be fine. You need to start tomorrow. I would be confused, I'd be anxious, I'd be overwhelmed, I might be really angry. Those are all behavioral symptoms. There's a skill set required to be an electrical engineer that I do not have. It's not about me being ungrateful to have the job. It's not about me being unwilling to work hard. I literally have zero skills to enter into the field of electrical engineering, right? So, and the more somebody pushed me and forced me to do that day after day after day, and their behaviors are escalating because I'm not working, I'm not doing what they want me to do, my behavioral symptoms will escalate, right? Maybe I'd get more aggressive in my language. Maybe I'd be shut down and overwhelmed. Maybe I'd be tearful. Those are all behavioral symptoms. The same is true for our kids who have brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. The difference is what I described is never going to happen to me. But what happens to them every single day is that they all day long are coming up a skill set issue, right? Having the adults who hold the power in the environment not recognizing that they don't have these seemingly easy cognitive skills in place, and that so no accommodations are provided, and they are becoming increasingly fill in the blank, right? Whatever the behavioral symptom is. So you have lagging skills, a child with lagging skills because their brain works differently for whatever reason. They're in environments where the expectations do not have any accommodations. They do not recognize that this child is lagging behind in these cognitive skills. They're things that we do every day without even thinking. That's when you start to see challenging behavioral symptoms. And here's a very short list of some of the common ones that parents that I work with describe with their kids, right? I want you, if you have a child who say is, I'd say 11 years old or older, and you feel like, oh my goodness, this resonates with me, and I've been parenting from this behavioral lens for all these years, is there any hope for this shift? I want you to know that without a doubt, it does not matter how old your child is. There is a lot that can be gained from shifting your perspective and starting to understand them through this lens. Okay, I've worked with parents who have kids who are young adults, and they're just coming to this information. The other piece that I really want to be honest about and clear about is this is not some overnight solution. I don't think those exist. So if you hear of them, I'd question them, right? Because this is about relationship. It's about us doing a lot of internal work to shift our perspective on our child and who we thought they were versus who they are, seeing them with empathy, getting more control over our reactivity, those visceral reactions that are so human and such a natural response to these challenging behaviors. So you didn't get there overnight. You won't get to this point of settledness, the way I describe it. I don't even know if that's a real word, overnight, but there is so much more hope than you have probably been led to believe with your child who struggles, who's so fragile, right? And struggles so much. One other piece I want to mention really quickly is that these cognitive skills that we have to use and work through every single day, they create a load for all of us. Most of us have enough cognitive fuel in our tank that we can get through the day, get through these cognitive skills tasks without being completely on empty when we're at the end of the day. Sometimes we are, and we understand that through our behaviors, right? We're more irritable, we're tired, we're like, enough of this day, let's just end it and go to bed, right? Those are our behavioral symptoms of having an empty fuel tank. So many of our kids get zapped halfway through their day, right? That's why they could have a good day at school in the morning and the afternoons are always terrible. Or maybe they make it through school and they come home to you and it's like, right? You ask them to do one small thing and you're recovering the rest of the night. So understanding that there is this cognitive load that builds with our kids, that we need to be really sensitive to that. We need to give them time to decompress and let their brain rest. So an accommodation, not having homework, not pushing on homework. Some parents are like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. You can do that. And that sometimes that's exactly what your child needs. They have to have time at night to reset, not to work their brain even harder. Okay. So I've talked about accommodations, understanding that there are tasks, expectations we want our child to meet, we want them to do. We need to be asking ourselves, what does the brain have to do in order to complete this task? Does our child have that skill? How old are they developmentally with this skill set, right? What age does their behavior remind me of? What symptoms do I see? That's usually where we go first. Like, oh, they always explode. I'm going to try to get them to not explode. But we need to back up. We need to look at what are we asking them to do and can they do it, right? And what accommodations can we really use to help them settle? So these sounds of behavioral lens versus sounds of thinking brain first. I just want you to take a quick look here and look at those. The ones on the left, you're not a bad parent if that's how you thought about your child. That's a behavioral lens. That's how society has taught us to look at behaviors. It's a very human response, so give yourself lots of grace and self-compassion. But the goal is to shift, right? What if it's not on purpose? What if they are experiencing pain and discomfort? What if they like truly don't get it, even though it's so obvious? What if they really did forget? What if they are developmentally young in this area, right? What if they are just, oh, they're so rigid, they just can't see this perspective, they can't shift? How would you then proceed down that path versus they're doing it to me on purpose all the time? They're so manipulative. Two really, really different outcomes. So I've talked a lot about this. I want to wrap up so we have some time for questions. But looking at what does a behavioral management lens target? They target the behaviors. The goal is simply to stop those behaviors at all costs. There's techniques that our society uses to do that. There are reasons rooted in neuroscience research why that does not work for kids whose brains work differently, right? Those traditional approaches require cognitive skills that that child does not have. They would be successful if they could. They would get the sticker if they could, right? It does not consider relationship, co-regulation, which we're not going to even touch on today, nervous system stability. None of that is looked at with behavior management, right? So thinking about that when you're given suggestions on how to parent your child, what lens is it coming from? So steps that you can take now, right? Asking what if, taking that step back from that challenging behavior and just saying, what if this has to do with their brain working differently and they're overwhelmed, they're fragile, what would I do differently? Giving your child more time. It's such a universal accommodation that so many of our kids need. Using fewer words, right? Usually we're talking faster and louder. The more frustrated we get, just stop talking and see what happens. You can always come back to it later. Accepting the need to reteach, focusing on relationship first and foremost, it will not lead you astray. Assuming brain function is at play and proceeding accordingly. What would I do if this really was about skill and not will? And then getting support from others who are also working from this parenting lens. That's a lot of what I do, is creating community among these parents because they feel so alone in it, right? And there's no reason for that. There are so many people like you and like I who are parenting from this lens. So these are some free resources that I've created for parents just like you in mind. So I'll leave those there while we're getting organized with the questions. If there are any that folks have, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. If you do have questions now, please go ahead and tap them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go ahead and answer those live. You also can raise your hand, and then you can ask over video too. So we'll give everyone just a minute to come up with your questions.
Okay, great.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, Eileen. It sounds like Eileen Ford has a question.
I do, yes. So thank you, Eileen, for your
Yeah.
really informative presentation today. Just a little bit of information on me. So I actually work with our foundation in our patient advocacy program. And what we do is come alongside parents who have kids who have challenges, and more, and generally originally it was physical health challenges, but
Mhm.
more and more we are seeing parents whose major challenges are in the area of mental and behavioral health.
Mhm.
And it was actually one of the parents that we work with who turned me on to your methods, and it has been utilizing them, and I have been sharing them with a lot of our parents as well. Challenges that we have in our state is it's extremely rural. There is a major shortage, major lack of resources, especially for mental health and especially for children. And so I'm curious, I have a lot of questions actually, but I'm curious how effective this technique or this approach can be if it needed to be like virtually, if it needed to be like from a telehealth standpoint.
Yep.
And then also how you find counselors who are utilizing these methods, like what
Yeah.
other terminology would you look for, or how do you how do you find a counselor if you feel like this would be the best approach for your child?
Those are great questions. So I work with all of my parents through telehealth. And again, I work with just the parents, and I'll speak to that in a minute. And so I can speak to the effectiveness of that very clearly and confidently. um, the reason I did that even before the pandemic, and the reason for that was because most of the parents that I work with cannot leave their kids. They couldn't get away to meet with me in person anyways, even their kids of older ages, because the behavioral symptoms were so escalated. They couldn't ask a family member to come and spend an hour and a half with them. So that piece I feel really confident about. The piece about, and so the reason I work with just parents is because a lot of this, 99% of this, has to do with the parent having a different understanding of who their child is and what they need, right? And I don't say that in any way to shame any parent who's been doing things differently. I was certainly in that boat. We don't know what we don't know. But once I understood, like, okay, my daughter is who she is, her brain works the way it works. No amount of pushing on her is going to change the way her brain works. What I need to do instead is take a step back, build my own resiliency, my own ability to be self-regulation, to be able to parent her very differently than I do my neurotypical son, to understand her through this lens. And there's so much that parents can do in all of that time that they spend with their child, more than I could do, I feel, effectively working just with their child. And that's not to say there isn't effective work happening with kids. It's just for this parenting paradigm, it makes more sense to me to work with the parents on the inner work, their response, how they see their child, how they understand what's effective and what's not in parenting their child and helping them grow their skills. The other piece, so then asking about how to find providers who are more aligned with this. I encourage the parents I work with to ask, what do you know about the brain behavior connection? How do you view behaviors? And you can even just hear from their language, right? Like, oh, they need to have stricter boundaries. You just need to be more strict. You need to say no more often. When all of that is about control. And all of that is about behavior modification, the very traditional sense. If they talk about connection, relationship, nervous system stability, regulation and co-regulation, then it's like, okay, they get it. Like, that's the same path we're talking about. If they understand collaborative problem solving, that's Dr. Ross Green. This is very much in line with collaborative problem solving. What falls short in my estimation with that approach specifically is that he acknowledges that there's some kids who don't have the skills to participate collaboratively in that process, but he doesn't really give a whole lot to those parents in that category to then go on. And that's who I work with mostly. Our parents who are like, I would love to collaboratively problem solve. My child like literally cannot do it. But with all of that being said, if they're familiar with collaborative problem solving with Dr. Ross Green, with Dr. Mona De La Hook, then her book Beyond Behaviors has a very similar philosophy, right? Then I think all of those are really encouraging signs. I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful. So then follow-up question to that, or different question altogether. How, I guess then how do you educate like your daughter's educators and other people who are interacting with her friends, peers, just the rest of the world, I guess.
Yes.
All of these things that you're doing in your home and as a parent, how does that translate into the other parts of her life where other people are interacting with her?
Yes, great question. So what I encourage parents to, a lot of what I do is help them be patient with this process, which is really hard to do when your child is struggling in such huge ways and they're refusing to go to school or getting suspended from school every time they go, that kind of thing. But they have to understand it themselves before they can advocate from this lens and this viewpoint with other people. So if there's urgency behind it, then sometimes I will support them in doing that more immediately. But what is ideally happens is we work together. I work alongside them to grow in their understanding of their child, the way their child's unique brain works, what this means for their symptoms, what it means for the accommodations they must have in their environments to be successful. And then they can start to use that same language with the people who also support their child, right? So it's like I said, it's not an overnight process. It gets easier over time because you're not on this steep learning curve, but there is a learning curve, right? But that's the ideal way that kind of progresses. Again, I understand there's urgency in some situations, and then finding a support person who has this language and can speak about it alongside you, with you, that would be the next suggestion if that's the case.
Okay, thank you.
Eileen, the last thing that I'll say, just in case this resonates with parents, is I am pleasantly surprised at how many people can make this shift. I think people want to think about other people in this way, and they're relieved to have this lens. Sometimes they fall away from it, and then my job is to help them come back to it, right? But there are some people, I know this in my personal experience, who aren't capable of making that shift. It was hugely disappointing to me. And my mentor said to me, some people just can't do it. And that's not your fault. You can't force it. And I was like, well, I want everybody to. But that's the other piece as a parent, to understand this person's just not getting it. And then therefore my child is not safe in their care or in this environment. And that's really, really hard, because sometimes it means a lot of upheaval, changing classrooms, changing schools, fighting systems that say, no, you're going to have to stay here. And you're like, I can't, my child's not safe, and they don't see it. Right. So I just want to recognize that too.
Right. Yeah. And that's where we get into challenges as well, and just not having as many choices for our parents.
Yeah.
Due to our population and the rural nature of Wyoming. Lots of great things about it, but when it comes to resources, and especially pediatric resources and mental health resources, we're definitely lagging behind.
Yep. I get that.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left for questions. So we'll do one more that came in through the chat box. Do you see a difference between your children who process differently, thinking one child is getting preferential treatment when they see a different kind of parenting toward their sibling?
Oh, it's a great question. Yes, this happens all the time. And so, it's going to be natural, right? I mean, kids, especially kids, are very focused on what is fair. Like, what is fair, what is equal. And so I talk with parents a lot about helping their child understand fair does not mean equal. Like with my 2 kids, I say fair is that mom and dad meet both of your needs, and that we help you become like the best person you can become as an adult, right? It's not going to look the same. The path there are not the same paths, right? It's going to look different, and that's okay. And talking about brains that work differently and what does that mean for each person's experience in the family, right? Like, so I go grocery shopping, I have to make a list, or I will forget, and I'll be frustrated, my behavioral symptom, when I get home. My husband doesn't have to do that. It's because our brains work differently, right? And so we talked from a very early age. I would say when my kids were in first grade, second grade, that age, helping them understand that, oh, if this brain works differently, they just need something different. And kids can get that. They're not as rigid in their interpretation of behaviors in the world as we are, right? So it happens with discussion, right? And then you have to have this openness about your child's diagnosis, or their brain works differently, or however you talk about it. Differences is the way we talk about it. That has to be present too in order to have that larger conversation. But it's really important as a parent to not let that stop you from giving the accommodation your child needs. If your child was in a wheelchair, you'd never say to your able-bodied child, oh, you're right, we're not going to build a ramp into the house because that wouldn't be fair, right? You're not getting something special too. Like, that's crazy, right? But we do it all the time with our kids who have brain-based differences. Like, oh, I don't know if I should do that accommodation because it looks like favoritism. It's not. They have this lagging skill. They need the support. So really common kind of question that the parents I work with grapple with. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are going to go ahead and wrap up now for the sake of time, but thank you everyone who
Okay.
attended today. Just a reminder that this will be recorded and posted on our website. You can go back and watch it. You can share it with others. I think a lot of people could get a lot out of this webinar, so thank you so much for everything. Our next webinar takes place on September 14th on the topic of understanding trauma with Dr. Amanda De Diego. And in the meantime, just a reminder that we do have free mental health support groups available and even free childcare for parents attending that group, thanks to a partnership with the YMCA. You can still sign up by visiting our website at oliviacaldwellfoundation.org. So thank you again for joining us today. We really hope that it was helpful. Thanks.